Hello everybody, my name is Lisa Anderson, Interim Managing Director at the Black Cultural Archives, and I'm really happy to welcome you to this conversation highlighting a fabulous show that we have on at the moment at the Black Cultural Archives, Revisions in Colour, exploring the works of Rudi Patterson. Alongside me, I'm joined by the excellent Wesley Kerr, broadcaster, historian, and horticulturist, OBE, as well as former chair of the Black Cultural Archives, Ms. Dawn Hill CBE. So let's get into conversation about this work. We're so lucky to have access to the cultural archive of Rudi Patterson, a phenomenal creative figure, born in 1933 in Jamaica, came over to the UK in the late 1950s, and then had an amazing career in film and theatre before becoming an artist and expressing himself beautifully through painting in gouache and watercolour, as well as becoming a fabulous ceramicist. So I want to learn a bit more about his work, how we came to have access to his fabulous archive, and I want to bring Wesley in here to find out a bit more about your personal relationship with Rudi and your relationship to this archive of works.
And Rudy was one of my best friends. I was probably over 30 years. He was 25 years older than me, so was a sort of mentor when I arrived in London and was sort of making my way culturally. And I was joined the BBC as a trainee in it. And there weren't that many influential black figures in London. There were lots of influential white figures. I had a fantastic, interesting career on programs like Newsnight when it first began, and BBC News, long BBC career, but we're not here to talk about that. But he was just the most sympathetic person. I first met him in the 1980s when he was living with his cousin Trevor at Finborough Road, Chelsea, Earl's Court, very much part of the London scene and the Earl's Court scene. And he and Trevor seemed to know everybody, like great friends with Freddie Mercury, through whom I met through them, had lots of jolly times. But Rudi was always was creating, always either painting or making a pot. And in fact, what I didn't realise until quite later was that I'd actually seen almost his last theatrical production. I'd been in the Gods at Covent Garden in the mid-1970s for a performance of Michael Tippett's opera The Icebreak, which was set in 1960s America with some rioters and hippies, and Rudi was on stage in that. So I'd encountered him actually first rather bizarrely at the Royal Opera House, but in the distance. But he was just such a live wire, and he was already established as an artist in the 80s, but probably not making big money. And he was involved in the Caribbean craft movement. So I remember setting up a stall with him in Jubilee Gardens in the mid-1980s. And he used to do things like paint t-shirts and sweatshirts, as well as the ceramics and the paintings. So he was constantly active. And over a long career, to summarize, so he had an acting career, a modeling career, really through the 60s. Worked at Michael Fish, but lots of amazing shoots. He was in an ad for British Airways. He was in a film with Cliff Richard. He was in
The Professionals.
He was in a film with Cliff Richard. He was also in The Professionals and Z Cars, which were TV classics of the 60s and the 70s. He was in a famous film with Mick Jagger, Sympathy for the Devil.
So just one of these key cultural figures in the it feels like from the swinging 60s through the 70s into the 80s, he was at the heart of this really exciting.
So he was a great person to meet as a young black person, and just a fantastic friend. And through him, of course, I met the great Dawn, who's not a contemporary of his, but knew him, I think, from the late 50s. So when they were both stars of that Windrush generation. So,
that's a great way to introduce Dawn into the conversation. Sorry, I always feel strange saying Dawn. Ms. Dawn, of course, into the conversation. I mean, you're one of the founding supporters of this very organisation. And I'm sure, I was in preparation for this conversation, I was getting goosebumps just hearing the stories of your, exploits as a young person in the swinging 60s, and obviously meeting and enjoying life at that time with Rudy. So can you say a bit more about how you came to know Rudy yourself and your experiences of him from the early days, say from the 60s, when he was getting to his height as a model and actor?
I met Rudy when in the 60s,
Yes.
swinging 60s, and he was part of a group of friends who were broadcasters. They all seemed to be on scholarship to the BBC from Sierra Leone and varying places. Glenn Foster Jones, who became quite big, and lots of really, they were very middle class Black people.
And you
young
came to know
people.
Moira Stewart, I think you introduced his show at Leighton Hall, is that right?
That's right.
Yes, I introduced him to Moira,
Oh,
yes. But he just, anybody met him, always remembered. But I think that Dawn has memories of the early Rudy.
Yes.
And also, I obviously didn't know him as a child, nor did she, but I think she has reflections on what it was like growing in Jamaica in the 1950s. He was actually a very poor background from Duckenfield. Yes, actually near the Bath Botanical Gardens, which I think is quite significant,
Yes, totally.
and plantation country. So I think his pictures often evoke almost a rural Jamaica of the 1930s and 40s, and it's a darker Jamaica than you might think if you really look at a lot of the pictures. But I think Dawn can talk a bit about the ambience of what it was like in late colonial Jamaica, and how actually there was a bit of social mobility in Kingston, and then what it was like for those early characters in swinging London.
So when you came to meet him, did you reflect together on your Jamaican background and like the aspirations of that community?
We were into fashion and art.
Wow.
And the group of us, we were always at the Royal Opera House for some reason or the other to see Margaret Fontaine dance. We absolutely adored her. To see Rudy dance at the Sadler's Wells.
Yes.
We'd always be on the first night audiences. Whatever was happening, we were there. And I lived in Cromwell Road.
Okay.
And there was a famous pub, which I don't know what's happening with it now, the Coal Hearn. On a Sunday morning, we'd all be there because it had the best music.
In Brompton, in fact, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
And Rudy lived in Wardour Street, of course.
I used to, when I was at the London School of Economics, and Rudy's son, he brought his son over from Jamaica, and he was always asking me advice about bringing up his son. So he became very close, and Orville would ring me, his son Orville Jr., Patterson, would ring me up about things, and I'd even go with him with Orville to hospital appointments. He became a proper family friend, but also, we were just the fashionistas, and we looked good.
It's so wonderful to hear these personal reflections of how the different expressions of culture and art were interwoven into your lives. From the love of ballet and performance through to theatre, and of course into seeing, and for Rudy, creating visual art. But tell me about...
At the same time, there were all these Caribbean artists.
Yes.
The Andrew Solkis, the Errol Lloyds,
Winston Branch.
Winston Branch. I have paintings of Winston Branch at home.
In your personal collection?
In my collection, obviously of Rudy's, and it was just
a very fertile time
for
Caribbean culture. Obviously, we have to talk about the Caribbean artist movement, which was key to creating, the Black Cultural Archives and so many of the cultural
institutions.
wasn't
in with that
crowd
particularly.
He's in with the craft element of it at
With
first.
the craft element of it, yes. Alison McNeish, who designed wonderful designs.
Liberty.
Yeah.
And were they trained as artists? Is that why he wasn't in that crowd, that he was self-taught?
He was self-taught.
So he'd been busy being an actor, really.
All the others were, because Rudy, the painting really started when he was recuperating from his
water skiing.
Water
He was a
skiing.
bit of a jet setter, wasn't he? So he was water skiing, I think, in Greece.
1970
Or I think late 60s. Dates were always quite funny with Rudy. People were surprised how old he was when he died, because I think but I think late 1960s, I think he had lovely holidays and things. He was doing well as a model, Michael Fish, selling those amazing ties. And he was in Greece, and I think with quite a wealthy friend, staying at their sort of villa, and he had accident water skiing and broke his neck. And they thought he wouldn't be able to walk, and he was in Stoke Mandeville for several months. And as part of the recuperation, he taught himself to paint. And what's interesting is he was exhibiting within a couple of years of that. So there was obviously a very profound natural talent.
Yes. And his friends, Johnny and Sue Sterling, they took him to their home and looked after him throughout all that recuperation. And he painted and painted, and when he was able, we had the first exhibition, and myself, Christopher Lynch, stylist at Mr. Fish, and Michael Fish, we actually hung those paintings.
Oh, really?
So was that in the West End?
It was in
the Arts Club, was it?
The
Arts Theatre Club.
The Arts Theatre
Yes,
Club.
and that's about 69, 70, the very first exhibition.
We hung that exhibition. We sold every painting.
How fabulous is that? And that's so interesting to reflect on the fact that when you look at these paintings, they're so reminiscent of that luscious, verdant, tropical landscape that Jamaica has. And he was creating this all the way across the Atlantic in London.
He had an immensely powerful imagination, and he went to the Caribbean a lot, and he would have pictures and picture books of old plantation houses or postcards, but he would build it up. He wouldn't map out the whole thing, he would build it up like in a corner, and he'd say things like, oh, should I put more flowers in here, or should I put a person in here? But they're not, I think they're always described as exuberant, and but actually there is darkness in the paintings. So often when there are not that many of the figure paintings are still around, because he sold so many, but often the figures are somewhat distant, or they're looking away, but the figures are tied to the landscape, and the landscape may look lush, but the plants in the landscape, they're not plants of oppression, but they're plants of sustenance. People don't grow breadfruit and mangoes and sugarcane and banana, the sort of things you see in so of course they're all very beautiful plants, and my father has them in his plantation to this day, Guava Grande in Clarendon. But there is, the Caribbean economy is obviously built on slavery and forced labour. But even in slave times, the black people grew subsistence plants, and that's what they were doing in Duckenfield in the 30s and the 40s to an extent now. So I think that there's, although they look lush and lovely, and he just loves plants. Some of them are not as subsistent plants, like the hibiscus behind you. They're actually about man's relationship with nature and the beauties of nature. So I think there's not as much struggle as people always want struggle in a painting. A black artist must portray struggle. But Rudy wanted people, I think, to have a happy and moving experience looking at his work. And over this long career, just to get this, 40 exhibitions he had, many one-man shows, but he had exhibitions all over this country, in Jamaica, in New York, in the Middle East, even 2 in Australia.
Melbourne, yeah.
Melbourne and I think Sydney. And I remember it was about the period I knew him in the mid-80s. And there was a very successful exhibition in Earl's Court, I think Carmichael Gallery. He sold most of the paintings, and then there was some left, and Freddie Mercury came and bought all of those. And then he got a Commonwealth scholarship. There was the Commonwealth Institute where he did lots of exhibitions. And he got, I think it was £1,000 to go to Australia. It wasn't quite enough, and Freddie topped it up. But I can't believe that there could have been a Jamaican artist who had sold one-person exhibitions in Australia in the 80s. I've got postcards from that time, as you probably have as well, Dawn. But talk a bit about what you think he's painting. It isn't just bliss, is it, that he's painting?
Well, Rudy's paintings you know, especially the hibiscus. He always had hibiscus growing in his balcony.
Oh, he did.
Yes.
You were saying his place is full of greenery.
Full of plants.
Full of plants.
Yes.
Full of plants.
So say more about that. Yeah.
And whenever he went, you know, he would go for tea. We'd go and have tea. And he'd have lovely cakes and things. And you'd say, "What you painting, Rudy?" And he'd tell us about it and show us and varying things. But what he did do, he's self-taught, but he didn't just look at, he would look into the books about Picasso and Renoir and all these sort of famous people about brush strokes, because there's a big issue about brush strokes. If you have a brush that looks one way or another brush that looks another way, what sort of feeling you can put into a painting and things like that. So he would tell you what he was doing. And we just loved his work.
And as well as gouache and watercolour, there were oils, and you see a development, in fact, definitely from the 70s, where they're quite simple and normally watercolours. Then the gouache, they become more colourful.
That one behind you is oils, isn't it?
Yes, but they also become more immersive. Some of the ones that are on the Black Cultural Archives on the Google site, which the estate has let you use, they are these very intricate tropical scenes, village scenes. They've done very well. I think Zadie Smith snapped up a couple of the last of those, but with so they've got people are not always in them, but there's a very, very powerful evocation of place, and it's a Jamaica that could be now or it could be 50 years ago. And there's a mysticism in them and a spiritualism in them. And the emotion, of course, is expressed through colour. And I think Dawn's point on the brush strokes, so they can be very impasto, especially some of the sort of quite tough oils, or they could be very smooth, or sort of sinuous. There's always movement in them. You feel that the flowers might be in the wind, or that somebody's looking at the flowers. The flowers aren't just there. But there's a strong sense of the painter actually in the painting, even though you can't see him. And these are, as it were, fresh hibiscuses, even though they were probably painted a quarter of a century ago. So I think he really evokes mood, and that's why he was so successful. That's why he had 40 exhibitions in life, 6 one-man shows since he died in 2013, lots and lots of events. So the shows have been from Hastings, Kensington, Chelsea, where he lived in 3 different flats, Twickenham, Willesden, Queen's Park. Here, a couple of events and a show now at the Black Cultural Archives.
And there's one coming
at the Garden Museum. Right. And the Garden Museum has acquired one of his paintings. And the Garden Museum has something called Saying Roots on at the moment about Caribbean horticultural history. And the exhibition is themed based on Rudy's paintings. The Evelina Children's Hospital, where Dawn is very involved, hospital for very sick, it's a school for very sick children. And they worked with some of Rudy's paintings, and they produced 2 exhibitions based on them. So there's something incredibly inspirational about him, and I'm delighted that as one of his executors, basically a couple of friends were with him not long before he died. We didn't realize he was going to die, but we thought a will needs to be made, and we were shocked to find just how many paintings and how many pots there were in his little council flat next to Trellick Tower when he died in the summer of 2013. And literally hundreds of paintings, hundreds of pots, and it took ages and ages to catalogue them. There was help from his friends Tony and Mary and novelette Ardoni Stewart, who came as a volunteer from BCA. So quite a lot of listing and recording, which enabled the exhibitions. But most of the paintings have gone since he died, and have brought money to his relatives.
Which is fabulous, a fabulous legacy to leave, both for his relatives, but for us in general, just it gives an insight into the rich history of pioneering cultural expression that's come from the Caribbean. Really exciting. But I don't want us to end this conversation without paying some attention and getting your reflections on his ceramic work, which is also surrounded by us here. Can you say a bit about his
I've got
crafting?
them in my house. I think in my conservatory at the moment there's one with tangerines and apples.
Paint on it.
Yeah. No, inside
inside.
it, but they go with the colours. And it was again, so he self-taught as an artist from the late 60s, and then I think he had time on his hands, and near where he lived in two different places, one near Chelsea and one in North Kensington. There were places where you could go to evening classes. I think it was Wednesday evenings, and he must have been the longest serving evening class student, because it meant there was the availability of a kiln and clay, and for 30 years, and he would make them at home. So he arrived for supper, and in the corner of the kitchen he'd be like making a coil pot, which was to be fired the next week. And he actually didn't like to sell the pots, but again they were crammed in cupboards and under the bed and stuff when he died.
Yes, I didn't know Rudy made so many ceramics. I've got several actually.
Yes.
Were very beautiful, but I just didn't know the extent of it, and that I even see the ones that are exhibited here at the BCA are quite beautiful, quite beautiful. But what I would like to say about Rudy's how he went about learning about what he was doing was, the market. We'd been Brixton Market on a Saturday. We'd been the Portobello Market, looking at all the wonderful fruit and the flowers and things. So, he was just immersed in all these different aspects.
And he continued to go to the theatre and exhibitions. So he would go every year to I would go with him to the Islington Art Fair in January. And he was particularly taken with how Bridget Riley could produce lots of coloured lines and make lots of. So he started. So he was constantly learning and constantly looking at things. And I think, as well as actually going to Brixton Market, I think he was aware of the market. He was aware of what would sell. So although he kept a lot, which he liked, he was aware of what would sell. So I think he was very much public facing as an artist, as he had been as an actor and model. So I think it's a great 50, 60 year cultural career that makes him one of the leading post-war British Caribbean artists. And it's been great that Black Cultural Archives which he was a supporter of for 20, 30 years. And that Black Cultural Archives is on the journey with him through the Google pages, through the exhibition, through previous events, and through the fact that you have some of his archive, which is of course part of the National Archive, and perhaps you'll acquire some of his paintings for your permanent collection at the end of this exhibition.
I personally definitely have put my sticker onto a couple of his works for sure. I just want to round up this fabulous conversation by saying a big thank you to both you, Wesley, and to you, Ms. Dawn, for stewarding his works so beautifully, because that has given us the opportunity to make these works available to the wider public and make, more importantly, the legacy of this creative, cultural pioneer well known for the whole world.
He'd be so pleased, wouldn't he, that Black Cultural Archives finally opened after he died, and that he's a key part of it.